hopefully in line of sight.
Yes. Started.
Good morning, everyone. This is Angus Blitter, and he's going to be speaking about simulated cyber war. Angus?
Okay, thank you. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out. I thought at 11 o'clock I'd have a fighting chance, but I know a lot of people were partying last night. So yeah, well, let's talk about cyber war. So the first thing, this is my disclaimer. I'm not going to read it to you, but essentially this is in effect, no warranties implied. Don't break any laws. This information is not warranted for anything and does not represent the opinions of the sponsors or my employers. So when we start talking about things, it's always good to have a definition. So I went and pulled the Wikipedia definition for war. It's up here. It's kind of wordy. After listening to some of Jason Scott's presentations on Wikipedia, it's probably not the best reference. However, I've translated it to be something a little more human-friendly, which is that you have 2 or more actively engaged combatants using weapons. Okay, that's a key term, to settle a disagreement. Okay, so to further a goal in some kind of end state. Also, this is one that I've found that I really liked: the continuation of political intercourse carried on with other means. That was kind of funny. And then we've all heard this one, war is hell, attributed to General William Sherman. And then business is war, which I couldn't find any attribution to that, but we've heard it before. And then the one that I like to talk about is, if business is war, then the internet is a battlefield. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So what is cyber war? RAND, which is actually a pretty good reference, I think they have a great definition that it's essentially talking about it's warfare in the information domain. And everything that information entails, keeping it from your enemy, misinformation, and this idea that information is power comes into play here. Marcus Raynham believes that cyber war is bullshit. There's an excellent session that he did in Dayton last year, which is the Other Ohio Hacker Conference at DACON, and he makes a pretty good case, and I'll talk more specifically why I tend to disagree with Marcus on this one. And then recently there was a 60 Minutes episode, and this is a quote from there: "There are thousands of attacks every day, tens of thousands of attacks." And my simple definition is it's warfare, but instead of bombs and bullets, it's bits and bandwidth. So what do we need to look at in when we're talking about cyber war? I think the relevant bits, the relevant attributes are its asymmetric nature. So this is, we get some feedback. This is war between vastly different resourced combatants. And I think this is the thing that is most relevant about cyber war. And so when we talk about, what are we talking about with this resource? The capabilities, the quality or the quantity of a capability. So for a very small investment of time and effort, an adversary can do a lot of damage. And when we look at who's probably most at risk, Nations or entities with the greatest capacity to wage cyber war have the most to lose. So if we think about, when we talk about critical infrastructure, you know, the power grid, there's an easy one. Anybody been involved in one of the power blackouts in the last 3 years? And maybe a couple hours, you can deal with it. What happens after a day, 2 days? You really start to realize how dependent you are on that critical infrastructure. You know, folks living in the desert or living in caves don't really have that liability because they don't have that critical infrastructure dependency. And the idea that you have kinetic superiority, basically your bombs and your traditional military, that strength does not necessarily translate to the cyber domain, does not guarantee you the superiority in that domain. And the idea that you have shared resources can be a liability. This again is talking about critical infrastructure. It's very simple if you have, you want to take an asset away from an enemy to go drop a bomb on it or to send a team to go take it out. But if that is a shared resource and you need to maintain that asset, like the power grid, it's very difficult to selectively take out a power, you know, that building's power, right? It's not as easy. So you kind of have to keep the critical infrastructure going while you do these kind of surgical attacks, and it's just not really practical. I mean, the analogy here would be urban warfare, right? You're going to have to get down and dirty. You can't really just send drones in and expect to get the results. I think we are definitely building in a capability for our enemies to take advantage of the smart grid. And I don't know if anybody is tracking what the smart grid is, but essentially we would give basically everybody's house or anybody that's using a meter essentially an IP address and a command and control type SCADA connectivity there. And I think that's actually could be a bad thing. Because like with most technologies, want to keep the cost low, so they'll take shortcuts and, you know, their embedded systems, how do they get patched, all those wonderful things. What's that? Absolutely. It'll be a target-rich environment. So critical infrastructure, this is another one, is not, I mean, it's not in the hands of the government. The critical infrastructure is primarily in the hands of citizens and corporations. And so it's not regulated. It's not, like an ITIL term, there's no CMDB that will tell you where all your assets are and the interdependencies. So cable modems, lots of bandwidth, those are in the hands of people that, you know, typically don't even understand what the technology is. They're just using it as a service, so it's a utility. And this concept that, you know, if business is war and the internet's a battlefield, this militarization of the internet, where your own critical infrastructure could be used against you. And we'll talk about amplification attacks and some things that we've actually seen in some of the games that we play. And then this idea of weaponizing software. I think most of us know that technology can be used for good or bad, but we are seeing where if we take an offensive stance, that we will have to, you know, the new bombs of the future will be weaponized software. So what's in a name? We'll just take a scenario, we'll pick on the power grid some more. Large section of the power grid taken offline. I think the last big one on the East Coast, Cleveland, was somehow tied up in it. I was in New York when it happened, and the first thing that came to my mind was terrorism, you know, because it was so fresh to mind. But it could have just as easily been human error. I don't think we'll ever really know what happened. It's not like there's a lot of transparency in that space.
First Energy had a problem where they were maintaining the trees under the lines. So there was a sagging, power sag or something like that, that basically one of the main feeder lines went out. I'm talking about the Northeast blackout of 2003, right?
Yes.
And that led to a cascade failure, and then some of the energy monitoring systems, GE said, oh, we found this bug when they were doing the investigation. So it was like 3 Mile Island, it was a combination of
Perfect storm, as they say, act of God, and the interdependency of this system, which is, again, the power grid is not one company, one entity. It's multiple companies and entities, and they don't really have, you'd think they'd have a lot of regulations, but a lot of the standards that they adhere to are voluntary. So it's very interesting to see what that happens. So in this case, it could be human error, it could be crime, it could be somebody. I mean, when you start now get to the point where, I mean, there could be a profit motive to taking one company's off the grid to push, you know, especially at peak hours, to push all the customers to using your service. That would be one potential scenario. Certainly terrorism, it's not as dramatic as flying planes into buildings and stuff, but you can wear people down if you don't have reliable power, or if it goes out every night at the same time. That would give you some cause for concern, and would get that kind of terrorism mentality going there to instill fear. And of course, in cyber war, you'd want to be able to take that, deny the enemy or your adversary of that resource. When we talk about cyber war, you know, talk about what's the motivation of any of these attacks. It's good to understand the motivation. I've got a formula I'll talk about why I think that's important. It's important to understand who the players are, but in reality, the two items that you'll hear discussed most in cyber war are attribution and jurisdiction, because it's what causes us the biggest problem. And attribution in a terrorism scenario, it's pretty obvious. The terrorist wants you to know that they did it. So there's a kind of a protocol. Something happens, there's a press release, and then the news picks up on it. In cyber war, understanding who does what, it's a little bit murkier. You won't really find very many states right now talking about the fact that they are engaged in cyber war. It's typically some fringe group. There may be some nation-state sponsorship. You know, they don't shut them down. They let them, you know, turn the other way. But it's very interesting because in war, you need that attribution before you can respond. There is a rules of engagement in warfare that all civilized nations adhere to, and one of those things require that you understand attribution. The other bit in jurisdiction is, why is it important if it was cybercrime? Well, in the United States, that's a different government agency that would deal with that. That's more law enforcement. Where if it's warfare, then that's the military. And that's important because the secret to being invisible is to be somebody else's problem. And if you don't fit that narrow description, it's very difficult to respond. And our laws really, and our structure is not set up to deal with this kind of ambiguity right now. But in the end, it's all academic because the results are the same. You've got critical infrastructure that is at risk. And the techniques are typically the same as far as the offensive computing techniques. So the same types of things that cyber criminals do and to take out systems or phish or do all the different types of things, those are the same types of techniques that would be used actors in a cyber war. And in fact, what you'll see is there's a linkage between, you know, you go get contractors, right? Everybody outsources everything anymore. So, you know, why not outsource some of your wet work to cyber criminals? They've already got the botnets, they've got the backdoors, they've got the capabilities. And if you're a nation state, you'll still have plausible deniability, and you can arrest them and shoot them, and then you have no witnesses. The defenses are, for the most part, the same. I mean, there are some things that nation states could do that the average citizen or critical infrastructure management couldn't do. Like they can stop all planes from flying, right? So they do have some techniques that aren't available, but for the most part, the defenses are the same. So I'm going to kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent here to talk about, you know, where the mindset is and where I come from as far as my research and why we started this. This is this concept of what I call point of origin hacking. And over here on the far left side, you'll see some point in time, somebody comes up with a theoretical vulnerability. They look at a system, they go, oh, you know, this is how I would break that. And I think, you know, most of us, I know we have makers and artists and stuff, but the hackers here, that's kind of You know, we're always looking at systems to find the holes in them, to hopefully make them better. But at some point in time, that point of origin, when somebody just thinks about it, and they don't do anything about it, and maybe simultaneously there's other people thinking about it, well, you know, boy, I bet there's a buffer overflow, or I could look for, you know, maybe fuzz that protocol or see what's happening there. Well, at some point, if there's enough motivation, if there's a reason to do it, that theoretical vulnerability, somebody is actually going to create what I call private capability. So that's at this P2 point, where somebody in the garage or in a research lab actually takes that theoretical vulnerability and creates some type of exploit for it. And you know, unless they're sharing it with everybody, that capability is unknown until somebody else either discovers it and publishes it. And at point you have a 0 day, and then what happens once the people say that theoretical vulnerability, well, it exists, we can't deny that it's there, they start to deal with it and you become operationally transparent. Now in a perfect world, once people know there's a problem, they'd fix it. But that's not really the case. And the reason this is important, I don't know if we have anybody who actually, you know, does information security work as a profession, but this is where the techies have lived for a long time. The sky's falling. Do you know how easy it is to own your systems? You know, and when we go in and we talk to the people who actually manage critical infrastructure, and we come in with the, you know, sky is falling, all these possible things, you know, Martians landing and things like that, we aren't perceived as being credible. And one of the big challenges that I had, especially in some architecture that I put together, I'd constantly get challenged, why are you doing that? And I would say, well, why wouldn't we do it? There's a theoretical vulnerability here, and all we have to do is architect a solution a certain way, and we're immune from that theoretical vulnerability. And the perception was, well, that drives cost, that drives complexity. And so that you have to kind of fight that, because what we're seeing is there are huge numbers of theoretical vulnerabilities. I mean, look at all the unauthenticated protocols on the internet. You know, Dan Kaminsky has been preaching about DNS for, everybody's known it's broken. They've proved it's broken. It's still broken and nobody's doing anything about it. So what I'm trying to do here with some of these is mathematically or scientifically figure out at what point do you really have to worry about these. And if you can take theoretical vulnerabilities and put them and fix them before they become real, so it's a bit of work in progress. Here's probably something that's easier to work with. Exposure index. Basically, if you have a motivated adversary that has a capability and you have a vulnerability, if you can drive any of those variables to 0, then you're in pretty good shape. As these go up, and we'll talk about this as latent conflict, because there's some other people who are doing that. And this is easier for people to understand. So you say you're exposed. And as vulnerabilities become public, your exposure goes up even more. So let's look at what we're tracking as theoretical critical infrastructure exposures. And we can have a dialogue, and you can tell me if you think it's high exposure or hype. Supply chain, okay? Supply chain attacks. This is more of a business term, but where do you get your hardware? Or some people get them from Best Buy. On large deals, you may order them from different places. So you don't really know where it's coming from. And supply chain is basically the path from the factory where it's manufactured, supposedly the vendor that you know and trust, right, that has the brand awareness there, and the vested interest in making sure they're not putting out rooted software. And then it goes to distribution, so it might sit in a warehouse, and those are typically regional, you know, or is your supply chain from eBay? I know the issue here that we're seeing, and the big concern from a theoretical, it's not really theoretical, but we've seen a lot of BIOS and firmware attacks, and Graham Nielsen did some really good presentations. Last year I was with him in Heidelberg where he actually did this against another, but he's been replacing firmware on security devices. So like Juniper, Fortinet boxes, And they all have the capability to be digitally signed. But because they've made the classic mistake of not doing the crypto right, they got the checklist that says, oh yeah, we have that technology inside, but it's not implemented correctly. So imagine if you couldn't trust your operating system on your embedded devices. I mean, it's not like something you just trust it. Why do you trust it? And why do you trust it, it's being touched? So one of the things here, as far as if you're building critical infrastructure based on what they call COTS, common off-the-shelf technology, my recommendation is that you create known good images and that you wipe everything and just assume that the box is, you don't have to assume it's compromised or anything, but you should actually put a known good image. Now that doesn't really help you at the firmware level. I mean, that's a huge, so look for supply chain breaches and supply chain integrity to become a big deal in the coming years. And I don't believe this one is hype at all. Embedded systems. So everybody understands what embedded systems are. You have them in your car. SCADA systems use it, but it's typically something that's burned to a chip. It's a dedicated system. Your printers, your smart printers have those. And the big challenge here is they don't have human interfaces. So if they're not on your patch cycle, typically if they're in manufacturing systems, they're not warranted to be patched. And these systems are typically built to last, 10 to 15, 20 years. And they're run by people who are not IS people or IT people. That could be a huge bot army. I mean, if you could turn everybody's printers against them, I'm really concerned about this. And we're putting these types of systems in more and more devices. They're going into appliances. In the future, everything will have an IPv6 address. You mentioned smart grid. So these systems are, I think, high exposure, and nobody knows anything about them. So more research needs to be done on this. I don't know how you really protect yourself against these other than trying to isolate them.
Well, this has already been seen in the field. Like last Christmas, the photo were going out the viruses. And basically people would be random gifts from China, and they're just full of viruses. Like when you plug it into the computer, it starts to solve viruses on the computer.
Yeah, and yeah, well, in the supply chains where you're seeing where the concern from the vendors, and again, this is where you just see where they're at. In the supply chain stuff, they're worried about counterfeiting because they're losing revenue. They're not necessarily worrying about the integrity of the critical infrastructure or your environment. And then on the embedded systems, again, those systems are very scaled down because they're meant to be fast, very specific, and a lot of developers have taken on using the Microsoft development. So they have way too many feature functionality because you could really harden these embedded systems. It would be very simple. You just turn off all those. I mean, this is Security 101. Turn all the services off that you don't need. Why do you need some of those hooks and the full stack in there when it's just going to be monitoring this one manufacturing process? And I see in enterprises, large enterprises, what we see is that there is no segregation. So they go ahead and they plug in all these embedded devices with their servers and their workstations. And what we're seeing even now, get requests all the time for things like smart vending machines. So, hey, that's innovative. Let's put an IP address in a vending machine, and then it can phone home every time it's out of soda. But that's got a full stack on it. It's not necessarily patched because the vending machine guy, they didn't want to come out and check the machines, let alone have to patch the box. So yeah, we're going to see more and more of this type. And my advice on this one, as far as mitigation, is just try to understand everything that's out there that has an IP address, and some of these devices at least should be segregated, if possible. At the very least, give them their own VLAN. That way, when you see something weird happening, you'll know, oh, that's the vending machine VLAN, or that's the printer VLAN, and it'll give you some ability to at least respond more intelligently. Rogue robots, okay? High or hype? I think it's high. I mean, we saw last year that I think there was Predator drones that had to be shot down because they went, well, whatever happened, they had to actually shoot them down. I thought they had kill switches in those things, but, you know, maybe again, it's cool target practice. And this is kind of where I differ with Marcus Random. I mean, Marcus Random definitely believes there will be cyber elements to warfare, but his contention of why cyber war is bullshit is because in warfare, you have to take and hold ground. That's really what it's about. So go take that hill and hold that hill from the enemy. And so he's like, you know, programs don't do that. But obviously, if you have remote drones and robots and things, they could go take and hold ground. So I do believe that, that we will see robots used in warfare, and I do believe that we will see robots that are assets for one organization that will be taken over and become assets for another. And they would be legitimate targets. I mean, I think they would be high-value targets if your robot force who was going out and searching for landmines, if you could somehow flip a bit so that, you know, every time they found a landmine, they said, oh, that area's clean, and then just send your troops in there. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting things. And most of these scenarios, we don't even have to be too creative, right? We could just read a book or watch a movie. I mean, all these types of scenarios have been played out, so it's just executing against those theoretical vulnerabilities. Okay, buzzword, bingo, advanced persistent threat, right? Is everybody familiar with that term? Okay, pretty much all the vendors now are taking their security products and they're saying, we will protect you against the advanced persistent threat. So I hate the buzzword bingo stuff, and I hate the way vendors sell on fear. However, it is good to see that people are starting to recognize that targeted attacks, if the motivation is high, if the prize is high, that somebody will spend some resource to target you, that they could very well be successful. And this is the idea that there is a long-term, persistent adversary out there that's trying to get in. And this is being pitched to a lot of large organizations. But when we talk about cyber war, you have to think of adversaries. They are doing that. And I mean, we'll look at the stages of cyber war and some of the systems that I think have some merit. And we'll come back to advanced persistent threat here in a minute. And then cyborgs. We have lots of cyborgs. Technically, if you have a pacemaker, you could be considered a cyborg. If you have any kind of augmented hearing or some of the things that are going out, and at ShmooCon this year, there was a pretty good presentation on all the different places where humans and machines are coming together. Now, if you've got a piece of software that's essentially, you know, a system that's an embedded system, no user interface, and you need to get a tune-up, how do they do that? Well, a lot of these are done via wireless. Okay, that's scary. They don't even have to touch you. And can you imagine a scenario where you could hold somebody's pacemaker for ransom? You know, I've got a button here. You pay me, cybercrime, right? You pay me some money, or I'm going to stop your pacemaker. You know, or yep. Or the insurance company, your insurance runs out and then you don't get the software upgrades because you didn't pay for the maintenance.
And then it doesn't get a bad over-the-air firmware update and you're saying, I got a problem.
Yeah, you brick your heart. So, so we are seeing that. And again, think of all the trends. These folks are healers. They have cost constraints. So they're not really thinking about security. They're not thinking about how this technology could be abused or weaponized. And if you have, you know, I mean, in some scenarios, maybe you would be able to turn a human into a bomb. So I believe these are actually real and relevant if we're trying to think about future things to be concerned about. So these are the spaces that I'm especially interested in right now. So what's a reasonable response to this kind of stuff? I mean, I talked to some of those specifically, but first you have to define what your assets are. What is your critical infrastructure? And when I say you, it's like you as an individual, you as a nation, you as a corporation, and understand the dependencies. I mean, I think a lot of people were surprised that their water stopped pumping when the electric went out. And I don't think they ever actually realized that those pumps, you know, require electric. And so there's this chain reaction that can happen. And you really should understand, at least at a basic level, where those interactions are. And of course, you can't protect an asset if you don't recognize it as an asset, and you're not going to spend resource to protect it. So this mind the gaps to understanding the economics of cyber war, I think that's important too, because really economies dictate so much of where we spend our resource, and this holds true for cyber war. So if somebody can take out millions of dollars of assets with a $5,000 investment, that is bad economics. That's the asymmetric nature, and you're going to be in a bad space there. We also need a classification system. I'm not really big on high alerts and things like that, but Win Shortall has what I think is pretty good classification system for talking about information warfare. So he's got it Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. So Class 1 is kind of, you know, this individual information. So if I'm profiling you, getting all your information, maybe for a targeted phishing scam, that kind of reconnaissance would be considered Class 1. Class 2 is what we used to refer to as industrial espionage, where we want to go steal some secrets. And again, let's talk about the economics of that. It's much easier to go steal technology than it is to develop it. And you can just, you know, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, the reason, at least that they state, that their prices are so high is because they have 20 years of research investment in there, and they have to be able to be assured to recoup that investment, or there just won't be an economic incentive to be in that business. So industrial espionage or stealing secrets, and then Class 3 is any of that information warfare bits that are actually nation state driven, meaning they are actively engaged in it and not through proxy. There's another one from Ned Morgan, and this is one I really like because I think this can start to set up who might be an adversary, not today, but in the future. And this is the idea of latent tensions, cyber recon, some initiating event or compelling event, cyber mobilization, and then cyber attack. And what he suggests is that you only have to look at who has tensions with each other, or let's say China and Tibet, right? Chinese government in Tibet. There was tension there. Political unrest, lots of things that we probably don't know about. So there was a motivation or a possibility that those entities would come into conflict at some point. And so if you have a scenario like that, if you're a nation state or an organization and you have these latent tensions, you most likely, just in case, are doing some reconnaissance, some proactive probing of their infrastructure, just in case. Because when you see these types of things where people's networks get taken out and you know, persistent denial of service attacks or things like that that you read about, there has to be recon. So you can't have a compelling event happen and all of a sudden the systems are taken out, especially if there's no attribution. It can't be surgical like that. So what that suggests is all of these things that are going on, there's been recon going on for years, maybe decades. And we know that the power grid is a favorite target for lots of different, presumably nation states, to map out our critical infrastructure. And hopefully we are doing the same to our potential adversaries. So you have the reconnaissance, something happens, a political event, a plane gets shot out, you have time to retaliate. The way we've seen things go down now, it's not a government that's doing it, it's through proxy. So either they have entities that get mobilized, cyber mobilization, cyber militia, through some postings, and they get everybody's, you know, blood boiling, and you'll just see kind of rogue elements going out and doing stuff. That is actually a pretty good technique because the governments can have plausible deniability. They can look the other way while those actors are doing whatever they're doing within the country border and not arrest them. And if they have to, you can shut them down once they've gotten somebody to some kind of negotiating point. And then if you actually have a cyber attack that's nation state driven, you know, whatever the objective is, it starts to happen. So I think this, as a classification system, is something that warrants more investigation. I don't know if you guys are familiar with either one of these, but are you guys familiar with basically the methodology for attacking a system? Like it's very similar. You do your recon, presumably you could take this latent tension and recon, and in between you've rooted systems, right? You would want to have that beachhead just in case you had to go into attack. And again, who's got the beachhead today? It's not necessarily the nation states, it's the cyber criminals. So you could see where a nation state could go to you know, some bot herder, some botnet, and go get some time on one of those systems, and they could do it through intermediaries or proxy. So you got a baseline and test. One of the things here, we talk a lot about anomaly detection. If you don't have a baseline, if you're not testing your controls, you don't know if they're going to be effective. So how do we test? Play a game. And research, train, test, and prepare. And that's kind of what we've come up with. You know, if we look at the games people play, classic games like chess, Go, and backgammon, there's strategies, well understood. We've taught computers to play these games. We have people who are really good at it, and it teaches you certain attributes of strategy, and there's some benefit to be had there besides having fun. I'm a big fan of moderated games. Back in the day, I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. Imagine that. But those are more the role-playing games. So, you know, there's scenario-based. You have certain characteristics and parameters that you have to be in. But there's also an element of flexibility with the moderator. So they tend to be a little bit more interesting and fun. And they do teach some skills as far as how you might interact with, you know, a dwarf and trading silence, and, you know, so maybe not a lot of good value there in reality. These certainly simulators, flight simulators, driving simulators, the Sims, some of the simulations on running companies. I mean, those tend to be more fact, numbers based, and you can learn things from those, and certainly. You know, you would want to practice in those flight simulators before you actually invested people in safety and possibly crashing planes. And then there's this new, what I'll call very immersive. I think Second Life is a very immersive environment. It's not really a game per se, but it's an environment. And World of Warcraft, Evercrack, Halo, those type of things, especially the first-person shooters, you're seeing more and more of them. Are very realistic, and it's interesting. I think that's where the military is going to be recruiting people from. I see a lot of these commercials on, you know, directed to kids in between some of their shooting type, even in ad placement. It's very interesting, but I think these types of games. I'm sorry, the synaptics, benign. Okay. So, why play games? They're effective tools. Flight simulators would be the perfect example of how they're effective and why they make sense. They're accessible. Again, if you have to, you can simulate things in a software environment, hardware. You can build these environments in a safe space. Very inexpensive. They're controllable. If we're going to be playing war games, we wouldn't want to play war games on production systems. So it just doesn't make sense. So you have to have a kind of a caged off area to do that. Although people are playing war games on production systems. It's repeatable. When you control the variables in a controlled environment, and you want to change one variable at a time, and you run those things through, you can start to learn from them. So it's important that, that you have a repeatable process. They're safe because they're contained, very cost effective. There's some things you can't simulate, but for the most part, you can emulate them. And then modeling, or this idea of a digital prototyping capability. It's very easy to do that in these types of platforms. Again, because it's all software. Well, I'll tell you the way we do it, because I kind of jumped ahead into what Packet Wars is. But in the modeling, when we set up objectives, we control the objective. So if we say it's a capture the flag or King of the Hill game, where we put you in a battle space and you have to take an asset and hold an asset for a period of time, by changing either the asset type, right? So we could put two boxes out there. One's a Windows box, one's a Linux box with different versions. And watching who goes after what first, then we'd say, well, maybe it's the service profile, the attack surface. So we put the same attack surface on both of them now. So the only difference is the operating system, the vendor. And then we can tweak certain variables to find out if it fits a theory that we have. And we can run those simulations over and over, and then we start to get some statistical validity to what we're doing. And one of the things we early on, we would, to simulate, we'd go through and do a scan and actually build a virtual enterprise. So we take the same network that you have, but then virtualize it. And it doesn't always work because there's certain nuances. And when you're playing with really good people, they'll know if it's a virtual or real system. Okay, so this isn't coming through.
There are games known as battles that individual players and teams against each other in a race to achieve defined objectives. The rules of engagement are simple. Illegal activity of any kind is prohibited. Protect yourself at all times. Battles are designed to be at a low, medium, or high difficulty level based on the battle objectives and battle duration. Primary, secondary, and tertiary objectives are defined and assigned points based on difficulty. Battles have time limits and other defined constraints. Constraints are sometimes known to the combatants, and other times are not. Anything that is not expressly prohibited is allowed. Points are awarded for flair.
Okay, so that's basically our spiel, and that's the way the rules of the game. We created this Packet Wars about 10 years ago. We started running games at conferences, heavily influenced by the stuff the ghetto hackers did. I thought they took the games to a whole new level. And, we're billing this as the world's first cyber sport, and we're calling it an extreme sport. But it's edutainment, so it's meant to be educational and entertaining, and we have a sustainable business model, which is, some of my friends accuse me of being a capitalist, but in reality, every one of the best, why aren't the ghetto hackers running those games anymore? Because it's a pain in the butt, and you don't get paid for it. I mean, if you do get paid for it, it's overt. I mean, it's covert. You're not really going to know who you're sending those logs to. But the thing that the ghetto hackers showed me was that spectator-friendly aspect, meaning people aren't going to stay for 3 days, practice for a year to go run a game and play a game, and come to an event and not see any sessions, not party with any of their friends. But you want to pull them in, so you have to have the eye candy. You have to have visualization. And so that's what we've managed to do. From a sustainability standpoint, we've rigged it to be sponsor supported. So think about Little League baseball teams and things like that. The shop down the corner will sponsor them. We found a way to do that. So I see a future where we have Team Apple, Team HP, or just some random team that doesn't want to be identified. And if you really think about, from the business model, think about Formula One or NASCAR, which is serious business because people, they're testing out the new carburetors, they're testing out the tire treads, things like that. They get so much benefit out of that. And they've managed to subsidize that with the entertainment piece and the franchising of it. So that's kind of the concept. And we support solo and team play. So we've been, as a company, we've been in business for about 5 years doing this. And we try to come to the conferences. We're looking to recruit players all the time. And so the idea is that the more of these that we can run, the more potential skilled workforce that can be created. Also, we have some of our affiliates or associates that use this as a test platform. So they'll actually run recruits through this to find out if they, where they should place them in the organization or what kind of extra training they would need. We use it for team building, corporate team building. So there's lots of ways to take this, which essentially is my way to get companies to pay for us to run hacking games to leverage the effort. So in all the years that we've been playing these games, some things that I've observed that I think are kind of important, skills versus cooperation. I've seen teams that had what I would swore the best hackers there, and it would just, even the people who were playing, like, oh, we're going to get crushed. And they completely fall apart because they don't talk to each other. So this lone wolf, does not work in team play. And also, like, they don't listen to the rules. In a lot of the ghetto hacker games, they would penalize you for using too much bandwidth. And so here you have some hotshot with all his tools, starts plugging in and just throwing everything. Well, he's costing him points because he didn't listen to the rules. So this idea of creating the perfect team or getting an effective methodology is specialization. So you should have people that have some specialty, but you also need leadership. So you need a point person to run one of these. You have to have this coordination, and that should be collaboration, not comprehension. Because if you don't, you won't be a good team player. And ultimately, in a cyber war, I don't think there'll be very, very many lone wolves. I mean, I read How to Own a Continent. It was pretty cool, but not so realistic. Everybody needs support. Tools and standalone capabilities. One of the things that we see a lot, typically the internet gets taken away. So you have one of these battles that are going on, and the first thing is like, oh, the wireless is gone. Yeah? What did you think was going to happen? I mean, everybody either's putting up evil twins, or we actually, one year when we were playing the ghetto hacker stuff, we brought in our own private 802.11a, and then we brought in some, because it's, we're not jamming, that's illegal, but we did get some base stations for 2.4 gig phones. And the cool thing about that is if you hit find the phone, it just, and it takes out. So we had a button that kept hitting it over and over and over again. So technically, I don't think we were breaking the law there. But what happened was we took their asset away. So they lost all their internet connections, and they didn't have anything there. So in a real cyber conflict, what do you think is going to be the first resources to go, or that's going to be contaminated? Google's not going to be there. Or if it is, do you want to trust anything that's coming through there? So a true cyber warrior is going to have their own capabilities, and they're going to have it with it, and they're not going to have external dependencies like the wireless network, like the internet. So what you'll see more and more with the teams, they'll all bring their 3G cards, or they'll have other out-of-band connections, or they'll just bring all their stuff. That's the other thing that hits people. They've got Metasploit loaded. They know it's a vulnerable service. Oh, I've got no payload. The internet's not there. And they don't have anybody that can write plugins. And that was actually the first time we ran a game down in, is it NOTACON? It's been a long time. Mr. Fuzzy and Optics, and these guys were writing plugins on the fly. And that, to me, was amazing. And I think that would be a real crew that you would have. You'd have somebody that could write plugins. They're actually doing, now, the other thing about these games is you don't see a lot of 0 days flying around here. And that's the economics. A 0 day is worth a lot more than, winning a Packet Wars battle. Today, I think as we get the bigger sponsors, our prizes might become better. But You should have that capability or realize that you have that vulnerability. So you have that dependency on some critical infrastructure. If it disappears, this capability disappears. Be aware of it, even if you can't mitigate it. Diversity. This is the best thing. Having a whole bunch of AppSec guys on your team or a whole bunch of network guys, you know, you'll need diversity. So you need a balanced skill set. And if I were putting together a team, and by the way, that's why I started this. Nobody's running these games. So as soon as we make it a sport and everybody's running these games, then I can play again. But I would have definitely, you need somebody who's good at monitoring. If you're in an attack and defense, you need somebody who's looking at logs. Not glamorous work, right? But very important work. You need somebody who can code. You probably need somebody who's got some operating system experience, and then, you know, obviously some networkers are important also. But you can even have, you know, we had a guy that helped on the winning team at DACON last year, and all he really did was coordinate, was run back and forth and get people Red Bull and whatnot, and that's very important also. Offensive computing, you know, basically you need to be able to think like a bad guy, and a lot of defenders don't have that capability. So, and they don't know what's possible. So I think it's very important that they have that. And when we look at some of the things that we've seen there, firmware and BIOS attacks, I saw something a long time ago that you know, by a guy named Jason Spence. I don't know if you guys know Jason, but they were reflashing the firmware on a LAN, a NIC, over the wire. And there was a dialogue going on between Jason and the ghetto hackers, guys that run, and they're like, no, they're shaking their head, no. They wouldn't let him use that attack until the last day because it was so devastating. I mean, what can you do once your physical connection is compromised? So we've seen those, so they're very real. Authentication attacks, or what we'll call amplification attacks. This is an asymmetric ability. For a very small price of a couple packets, you can overload the back end through authentication attacks. So what we've seen is where people thought they were brute forcing something, they would never brute force the password. I mean, it was just, we were only there for a couple hours. They would never have got there. But what they ended up doing was they blew up the authentication on the back end. So they essentially did a denial of service attack with one stream. So that's something to look for, in that very small investment can yield very good results. And then inline social engineering or hacking history, where basically don't take candy from strangers. We've had people, this one guy, smart guy, he wasn't playing the game so much as was perusing somebody's hard drive. That's what he thought. So when he started downloading the tools in 0 days and compiling on the system, he ended up compromising his own box. So when you're in a battle space, I mean, there's nothing just laying around. Or if it is, everything's to be suspect. And again, this hacking history is the idea of doing inline bit switching. So it's like you go to Google, you look for an authoritative answer, or Wikipedia, and you get the wrong answer because there's a man in the middle changing things. So in summary, whether it's cyber crime, terrorism, or war, it's real. So this is not hype, it's actually happening. We all have a part to play. I mean, you need to understand what your assets are. You need to protect them. I could tell you that the government is not resourced to do this, so if you're hoping that the government's going to protect us from this, they won't. You have entities in large corporations that span geographies. They don't have passports, they don't have citizenship, and that's where most of the assets belong. I mean, if I were a bad guy, I wouldn't really be conducting too much on the internet. I would go after corporate networks, because you can pretty much stay hidden in there, and you can pop in and out of that all over the place. And they spend a lot of money on security, but they're not regulated. You need to develop capabilities, or at least understand the offensive and defensive nature, and what your role. So if you're a service provider, you have a lot of bandwidth, you have a lot of IPs. You know, those could be turned against you or others, so there should be some understanding of how they could be used and how you would react if they were being abused that way. And then get involved. I mean, definitely check out the website. We don't have a team up here in Cleveland yet, but if somebody wants to set one up, just get with me. We're trying to put these as like franchises, and to be a sport, right, you don't have to have a lot of equipment, and you should be able to do pickup games. So it's not really there yet, but we would like the idea that there'd be games going on all the time. And with that, I don't know if there's any questions. We've got maybe 2 minutes. Yep.
With the one slide about the exposure index, the full equation with the vulnerabilities there. Say you're a security researcher that finds some certain vulnerability. There is, I mean, you could just release it on the internet or publish it, but that would drive up the exposure index. Do you keep like that company? So heads up. But I've read where it's kind of debate on how much time you give the company or should it actually ever publish it.
If you want a binary answer, I'm going to say full disclosure all the time. And I know a lot of people want to do responsible disclosure. In my day job, I don't have, I have to abide by that. But my personal feelings on the subject is people don't react. They don't fix it. They try to hide it. And that is full disclosure in real time. Now, if you're using that vulnerability, you know, it's an asset. So if you're a government, nation state, you wouldn't want to do that. And it's funny, Marcus Random was describing, yeah, you've weaponized the software and you're ready to go to attack, and the general calls you in and says, we need you to go attack this network and everything. You go, well, yesterday was Patch Tuesday, so now all our weapons don't work. So there's that kind of thing. So it's definitely an arms race, but the only way people will react is if it's out there and it's real. I don't see people reacting that way.
Yeah, how do you deal with conflict of interest? So like, if there's an Apple team and there's an Apple target in the game, they have a vested interest in moving people other than Apple.
Yeah, we have to deal with that. Now, Apple's never approached us, so we haven't had that problem. But we do sometimes. Typically, our technology partners that we use to do visualization, they aren't targets. So that's how we've managed it to date. But there's that potential for conflict. I think, unless there's anything else, we've got to wrap it up. So I appreciate you guys getting up and their attention, and I'll be out here if anybody wants to talk to me today. Thanks.